All right, welcome everybody to the special Rising Tide Foundation special edition. We're going to be going through some fun stuff. I know I got a lot of really great feedback. About a month ago, I had a great conversation with Myriam Charabaty on the topic of just the manipulation, the profiling and manipulation of a lot of conservative, Christian-minded people across the North American, European continent, especially towards a revival of a new tribalism, a new dangerous crusader ethos. And Miriam is going to be going through a little bit more unpacking of some of the stuff we just provocatively brushed upon ever so briefly in the course of that interview, which will be in the description box. Today, I won't be able to be here for the majority. I'm going to listen to as much of Miriam's main presentation as possible, but I have to go and do another event. So Jerry and especially Madeline have agreed to take the lead in moderating and hosting, so everybody knows Madeline and Jerry. Madeline, say hi. All right.
Hello, everybody.
Okay. So Madeline will be taking your questions and fielding them to Miriam once the main presentation is down. And I'm going to just sit back and enjoy the show as long as I can. So without further ado, Miriam, it's all yours.
Hi, thank you very much, Matt. I wish you would have been around a bit longer, but fully understand. I look forward to this. So, the last time we had a conversation, we were talking about how. Um, okay, I have full access. Cool. Sorry, I just discovered that. So, the last time we were talking about how, as Matt said, the terminologies, the wording used to mobilize a Christian position for political purpose has re-emerged as a very prominent talking point in the last few years. So I'm gonna brush over some of the things we talked about, Matt, just so that we can draw the full image and then slip from that. So when we talk about the Crusades, historically, the term Crusades emerged centuries after the Crusades happened. Initially, uh, all the terms that reference these wars reference them from a geopolitical perspective. Right? So for the Arabs, so the Arab and Islamic world actually, the terms were often the Frank Wars or the Frankish Wars. And that aimed to do two things. First, to show that the wars were not based on religious foundation and grounding. Second, that they were founded in a foreign invasion. Right? So it's a foreign intervention within the Arab and Islamic worlds. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it was to protect the Christians in the Arab world. And the Christians in the Arab world actually, for the most part, did not join crusade campaigns to save the Christians. In fact, the Crusades, as we know them today, they resulted in the death and isolation of a lot of the Christians in the Arab region, especially in the Levant. So the term crusade emerged somewhere around the late 18th century, right? It emerged before informally within the 14th century or so, but on a formal level in historic writings and political writings, it emerged somewhere around the 18th century. And that puts us to question why it emerged that way. Why did we move from discussing a Frankish war, which at the time of its happening, so when Pope Urban II made his speech in France, the situation in Europe was not great. The circumstances were also not great. It was a feudal society. A lot of folks needed an alternative. Given the growth of population, the feudal system, they needed to expand their trade routes. Historically speaking, pilgrimage throughout the Islamic rule in the region, there was never a ban on Christian pilgrimage from Europe or beyond to Jerusalem. That was always open. Um, However, when the Crusade campaigns were being prepared, they were being prepared as militarized pilgrimage, right? The first crusade, which is the Peasant Crusade, was actually something that resulted from mobilizing emotionally and unwillingly, to a large degree, the peasants in Europe. And they were not prepared to go on these campaigns, right? And so they ended up pillaging a bunch of towns on their way. And most of them were actually Christian Byzantine, Christian Byzantine towns. And that's because they ran out of food, they ran out of stocks, they ran out of capabilities, and they started pillaging and looting wherever they landed. But that was not part of the planned crusade. The planned campaign was essentially plotted for the elites, right? And it was plotted for the elites because the idea was to not just take over Jerusalem, but to build alternative trade routes. And in doing that, take advantage of what they can within the Byzantine Empire, and then take superiority advantage in the Arab world, right? So switch over, take over control of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem at the time was the whole of the Levant, really. It was one of the most important trade routes in all of Asia and Europe. It was a local central hub for that. So it was really a targeted geopolitical goal. So later, when we're talking 14th century to 18th century, when it was formalized as a crusade, that formalization kind of gave it a sanctified definition, right? It gave it religious um, purpose with a superior moral understanding of what it was. And that's when it was framed as particularly a Christian against Muslim war. Now I'm gonna jump a bit into that. I have here in front of me, let me just share my screen. I have here an interesting copy of just let me find it. An interesting copy from the monastery of Sinai, Saint Katrina, in Sinai. And what it shows, which is this, right? This is what it is. And it's actually written in Arabic if you zoom in. What it shows basically is a letter of protection from the Prophet Muhammad through Imam Ali bin Abi Talib to the monastery. And it was an official document that gave the monastery, the monks, and the Christians in all of the region a freedom of mobility, a right to express and conduct religious and cultural ceremonies. And basically, that was passed on to a number of Christian, Jewish, Sabaean, and later Zoroastrian groups and kind of religious monasteries or locations, synagogues, etc. So that just comes to prove that uh, there is manuscripts and documents that actually prove that Islam, in its essence, had no intent or no intention of eliminating Christian presence in the region. They consider us the people of the book. There has been historically certain conflicts or disagreements, etc., but that is the case in any society that contains a multiplicity of religions, ethnicities, and faiths, right? So that exists within Christian countries and by themselves, let alone in countries that bring together three of the biggest religious faiths. So when we understand that, we have to think about how the crusade came to create an aspect that did not exist uh, in our understanding of history. The aspect that it is Islam in the face of Christianity, as if they existed as inherently opposing creations that cannot integrate. Right? The truth is that in this region, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are came in a sequence to each other. And a lot of the Jews became Christians, a lot of the Christians became Muslims as that developed. And a lot of the switches from Judaism to Christianity to Islam actually also came through causes of social needs and through causes of trade for a large degree. So through trade, integration, social growth, etc., that development happened. And if we look particularly into the history of Islam, we see that, sorry, even Prophet Muhammad, one of his teachers close to him, was actually a Christian monk. There has been no direct conflict between Christianity and Islam from an existential perspective. The perspective through which the conflict existed has been political, certain social dynamics, etc., etc. So the status that Islam gave non-Muslims within the Islamic world was what is called the dhimmi status, which in Arabic means under our protection. Right. Now, Zionism, moving forward, in parallel or in the same way that they recreated the sanctification of the Crusades, they recreated the meaning of the term dhimmis to explain it as those who have agreed to be subjected to Islam, when in reality, what it was giving those groups their own rights and certain level of autonomy, but and they would not join the army. And instead of joining the army, right, because their numbers are minorities, so instead of them joining the army, they would pay a certain sum, right? And this actually exists today in all of the countries that have mandatory enlistment. So if you don't want to enlist and you are forced to enlist, what you do is you pay something in return to that. And the rest of the payments came in the same form of taxes, right? So Islamic rule actually engaged in repair of Christian monuments and Christian churches and Jewish synagogues after fires happened or natural disasters happened, right? So it came more in a sense of structuring society, regardless of whether I agree with it or disagree with it. I'm explaining the structure it came within, right? And that's a debate you can have within any community. But the most significant aspect of it is that over time, it became a term that signifies a certain sense of subjugation. And that actually echoes what was happening during the Crusades. So when the Crusades happened, they tried to reach out to some of the Christian groups within the Arab world, right? One of them were the Maronites in Lebanon, not the ones in Syria. And they had a certain agreement with them, where the Maronites were actually facing persecution by the Byzantines, not the Muslims, by the Byzantine Empire. And their agreement with them was, we will kind of accept you as an official church, because the Byzantine Empire was not doing that. They actually considered them heretics. So they accepted them as an official church in exchange for help in figuring out mountain routes to get around certain Muslim uh, strongholds and fortifications. Right. So these things existed. And that kind of relationship, at times it grew and at times it fell back. And I'm saying that because not all Maronites in the Arab world have held that position. It was very particularly the Maronites that were present in Mount Lebanon. The Maronites actually of Syria and the Christians of Palestine today, they predominantly fought within uh, they predominantly fought within the military ranks of Muslim Muslim militaries, right? So we're talking whether it's the Fatimids, the Umayyads, the Ottomans, etc. Actually, Christians, in the face of foreign intervention, especially in the cities where they were found, they often fought alongside the Arabs and not alongside the Crusaders. Now that brings us to another interesting dynamic, and it's how historians in the Arab world adopted the term crusade. Right? So for the longest time, our entire perception of that era was that this was a foreign war. Right? So there was no divide in the Arab world between Muslims and Christians on that point. However, somewhere around the late 18th, early 19th century, when European missionaries became the region with books, after which the terminology crusade had been established in European understanding. So that was, in a sense, the early era in which people on this side of the world, so the people that faced the Crusader Wars, acknowledged the Crusader Wars as Crusader Wars, not as Frank Wars or Wars of Frank invasions. And in doing that, a certain sense of radicalization emerged from a perception of Orientalism. So the elites in the Arab world began adopting the terminology and thus inherently the perception put forward by the West, right? Through those missionaries, through the universities, and especially under the French mandate that became much more prominent, and the British mandates, in Egypt and in Jordan, in Palestine, Lebanon and Syria, it was the French mandate. So in that understanding, we began adopting a certain position of questioning whether we as Christians are superior to the Muslims or not. Right? So that debate of Christianity in the face of Islam and not as a historically changing dynamic began emerging. And that, again, that echoed certain positions of certain Christian groups that had allied with the Crusade in the past. So it had a certain set of foundation, and then the flooding of information that came with the missionaries and Orientalist institutions emphasized that. And that drove us to a certain kind of eugenic debate, right? Which is now more commonly emerging as, oh, are Christian Maronites or Christian Syriacs, are they Arabs or are we not Arabs and we were occupied by the Arabs, right? And that eugenic definition has no foundation because there is no concept in history of a static identity, right? Identity is ever changing within the same group dynamic, right? So the dynamic is constant, right? But the group in which it's happening can be static, right? So Judaism came, Christianity came, Islam. So that's a dynamic of change. Trade routes emerged, developed, changed. Education, type of society, type of trade, growth, development of city-states, etc., etc. That's a dynamic change, right? And similarly, those identities changed not by force, but by need. So if you go until today, if you go to Malula, for example, in Syria, you would see that they continue to speak Aramean. And they're the last group speaking Aramean, which is Jesus Christ's original language. But they speak Aramean amongst each other and they speak Arabic with everyone else. And that's the nature of the language. And that's why Arabic is one of the most developed and expansive most difficult languages because it actually was able to integrate within it a large group of smaller scale linguistic identities. Wait, so these people were not forced to forego their language and adopt Arabic in its place. In fact, because of social dynamic changes, because of trade, because of growth from one city to the other, Arabic became the language that connects all of these big trade cities. And through that, it became the language that most people speak. So the eugenic approach of, oh, I'm originally Syriac, doesn't really fit because that is not something that you can go back to because it changed due to social change and not by force, right? It's not like the language was barred from existence and you're reviving it. This is not what happened. The language continues to exist. It just integrated and emerged through trade and social dynamics. Now that drives me uh, to the other question of the rise of Christian Zionism. Now, why am I connecting the two? It's because the rise of Christian Zionism with the Scofield Bible that was widespread through actually, if I'm not mistaken, the Oxford Press. It emerged in 1909, right? So it emerged into existence in 1909, and the first Zionist organization meeting happened somewhere around the late 1800s, should be maybe, I have it somewhere here, maybe 1897 or something of the sort. Yeah, 1897. Wait, and that brings to question a whole set of perspective that we need to look into. Because when that happened, a new version of Christianity came into existence. And in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, the British offered Palestine to the Zionist movement, right? And the occupation of Palestine occurred. But before that, the Zionist movement was actually looking into alternatives of where it can exist. Now, the reason it was moved to Palestine is complex, but one of the main ones was the understanding of how we divide a region in which the social fabric is relatively very well tied together. Right? So you need to break up a whole piece of land, a whole chunk of land, where the trade has developed brilliantly over time, where the social fabric has faced so many conflicts, but maintained its diversity and dynamic, right? And a social fabric that has clearly over time refused any foreign intervention, despite all of the internal struggles they might have in facing each other. They have historically refused foreign intervention and foreign invasions. So how do you do that? And the idea came forward with, let us create something called the barrier state. We create the barrier state, and that's what today Israel serves as. Right? And that barrier state, around it, is a set of states that are incapable of sustaining themselves in and by themselves. Right? And in that way, they are actually incapable of developing beyond a certain threshold, and whenever they do, they are destroyed. We saw that with Egypt. When Egypt started to grow and expand and establish a certain power in parallel with Syria that is capable of liberating Palestine, there was collective agreement in the West that we need to get rid of Abdel Nasser, we need to get rid of Hafiz al-Assad, and we need to subjugate both Syria and Egypt. Right. Lebanon, on the other hand, and that's something Kissinger put forward. He said, you will be shocked with Lebanon because despite it being the smallest country, it will have a group that will change the map. Right? And he was referencing Hezbollah at the time. The truth is that this is precisely what happened. Now, in understanding that, we go back to the Schofield Bible. The Schofield Bible is completely detached from anything Christian whatsoever, but it was one of the most widespread books. In fact, it is Cyrus I Schofield's reference, which is basically notes on the Bible, right? So it's not particularly a biblical text, right? In the traditional sense, or in any sense, it's someone's notes on biblical texts, right? And it was very widely spread through the Oxford Press, which at the time had a large Zionist presence. Now that served a purpose of creating a version of Christianity that would, over time, change the fundamentals through which Christianity perceives its existence vis-a-vis Islam and vis-a-vis Zionism, right? And the first thing that happened in the face of that is that Arab Christian movements came out and said, there is no such thing as Christian Zionism. You are either Christian or Zionist, right? And that position is maintained. Now, the Vatican at the time, very interestingly, was initially against the establishment of Israel in Palestine. And that had to do with the presence of the main churches, right? The Holy Sepulchre and the Nativity, Church of Nativity. So in that understanding, Vatican did not recognize Israel except until the early 1900s, the late 1900s, I think 1993 or 1993. So that era drew a division between positions of Christians and positions of Christian Zionists. And there was a lot of confusion as to where people should identify, right? After 1993, after Vatican's recognition of Israel, the position of Christianity in the Middle East also completely changed. It completely changed to kind of subject Christians of the Arab world to not engage in the Arab Muslims' bid to liberate Palestine, right? And that once again created a schism between Christians, especially the Catholics, and the Muslims, right? Between the debate of should we liberate Palestine or should we just accept the de facto situation and wait for some diplomatic solution, and eventually it became the two-state solution, and that whole debate emerged. But during that era, the presence of Christians in the region diminished radically, right? So between the early 1900s and 2025, Christians dropped from being somewhere around 30% to somewhere around 1 point something percent in Al-Quds. Right? So that's radical. And that says a thing or two about where Vatican stands vis-a-vis the presence of Arab Christians, because Christian Zionist presence in Israel increased, right? But that falls within the Zionist project, not within the Christian presence in the Middle East, right? And that falls in opposition to what Arab Christians, just as much as Arab Muslims, have a right to, which is their land. So putting that framework together, I think it's important to look back at the Crusades from a perception of Frankish wars, right? The mobilization of a group of people, which is now being publicized with We are running campaigns to influence Christian, Zionist, and evangelical youth, right? This is being publicized in Western media, should really pose a question about, has this turned into another Frankish war of invasion for the purpose of looting and trade? Or is this truly a Christian position? And in asking that question, it will drive us to ask about what happened to the just war doctrine of Vatican. So in 2016, it was put forward for review. And it's still, I think, its status remains under review. But what the just war doctrine stands for is, in fact, this. Let's go check it out. It stands for this. The strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force requires rigorous consideration, and there are four considerations. The first is the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success, and the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating the conditions. Right. Now, if we look at these conditions, and we look at what has been happening in the Arab world through the support of NATO, the US, and through the direct actions of Israel, I believe we have a few set of answers. The damage inflicted upon the region has resulted in millions of deaths. Now, what is often sidelined by Vatican and by church leaders anywhere is the use of proxy warfare as a real version of foreign aggression. Right? No one has addressed proxy warfare in the Middle East or West Asia or the Arab world, whatever it is you want to call it, in that region, as a direct version of foreign intervention without having foreigners be killed, but mercenaries be killed. However, the result for the people being invaded is the same. It does not change, right? So if we take into consideration proxyism as a modern version of warfare, and the weapons used by the US in Iraq and by Israel in Palestine, Lebanon, but even Yemen, Iraq, Syria. If we look at all that, and we look at the result of deaths through imposed economic strangulation, some through sanctions, others through what is the so-called peace accords that came as a subjugation through regime change, as the case with Sadat and others, we see that the number of deaths is actually very high. It's somewhere in the millions. And the damage inflicted by the aggressor on those nations or community of nations has been lasting. So we're talking somewhere from the early 1900s, and we're in 2025, moving into 2026. I would consider that a relatively lasting plan, because there is no plan to end this anytime soon, right? And so the other means of putting an end to it must have shown to be impractical. Well, the Pope himself, on his last trip from Turkey to Beirut, he was asked about the cause of Palestine. And he said, the only solution is the two-state solution. Then he reaffirmed that we know that Israel is not ready to accept the two-state solution. So he kind of agreed that this is a delusional solution, because you cannot accept a two-state solution with one state refusing it. Right? So what two-state solution are we talking about? That's on one end. And then the other question, the other thing he said is he referenced his position, or Vatican's position, on Israel, saying, we consider Israel our friends. right? I did not feel like he needed to say he considers the Arabs as his friends, right? Why do you need to highlight one group as your friend while not the other group, right? This comes to show an understanding of who the aggressor is and who we need to tiptoe around uh, vis-a-vis the truth and the reality that has been perceived by everyone over the past decades, in my opinion, but at least 2 years um, for the majority of the people. So we see these two things. So there is uh, there is a prospect of um, putting an end to it, but it does seem impractical or ineffective. Um, and there must be serious prospects of success. So if it was to be launched, right, a just war, if it were to be launched, it must have prospects of success. In my opinion, at this point, the Islamic resistance movements have proved potentiality of success, except it is the quote unquote Christian world um, that has been actively prohibiting that, right? And I say Christian world, quote unquote, because in my opinion, it is devoid of anything Christian, and it's more of a Frankish, it's more of a Frankish war, right? Despite the constant trying to prove a sense of Christianity, whether it's in Europe or in the US, or even unfortunately in Vatican, it appears to be more politically positioned in its sense of neutrality than on a moral, ethical basis. Because we did not see the same moral ethical basis in regards to Russia, Ukraine, for example. They were very prepared to stand in defense of Ukraine in the face of Russia. They were not nearly as prepared to do the same in the face of Israel. And I think that kind of aligns them a lot with NATO rather than aligns them with a certain moral, ethical set of perception. And so when we look at it, um, in my opinion, we are looking straight up at a new version of the Frankish Wars that is being manipulated at the hands of politics to drive Christians to a perception of what the Arab world is that is devoid from reality. So they would tell you today that the Arabs are persecuting the Christians in the region because we saw ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, suicide bombings in churches um, and amongst civilian people. Right? What they don't tell you is that Al-Qaeda and Nusra, ISIS, they have killed as many Muslims as they have killed Christians, if not more. Right? And the ones defending in the face of those proxies definitely have been Islamic movements. And if not Islamic movements, then they have been national militaries that include Sunnis, Shias, Druze, Christians, and really all groups and ethnic and religious backgrounds. So that image of Islam as that backward killing machine in the face of the poor, good Christians that need saving is re-emerging. And the truth is, Christians have not come out saying we need saving, not from the Muslims at least. Christians have come out saying we need the end of intervention. We need the end of support for proxy warfare. We need actual sovereignty. We need the liberation of Palestine. But these are not what we're hearing in the media because they're not being emphasized. In fact, they're being suppressed, opposite to the case with the few Christians that have adhered politically or religiously to the Zionist atmosphere and political rule. Now, I don't know if that drew a full image of what I'm trying to say and explaining how the Frankish wars at the time resemble what is happening today and echo very clearly in today's warfare versions. But Chris, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks for your talk. This is just fascinating. I wondered if you followed the work of Father John Romanides on the false. He's written a bunch of books on the fact that the schism between Orthodox and Western Catholicism wasn't a schism. It was actually a conquest of the former Roman states by the Franks, and it was more like an enslavement and obliteration of the Roman Orthodox Church. I'll pop a link in, but it's just um, I know you're talking more on the contemporary aspects, but I guess it's all kind of contemporary if you conceive of the Western Holy Roman Empire is continuing to this day in the ancestry of the Western aristocracy, which is his contention. But I'll pop a link in there. Think it's fascinating that both from a Muslim and an Eastern Orthodox perspective, the Franks are a huge problem. It doesn't get discussed very much. That's all. But thank you for the discussion.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm not an expert on his work. I have gone through some of it, and I definitely consider it fascinating because the way I got to him was when I was looking at why has Vatican's positions become so political, especially in very specific eras where geopolitics peaked, right? So we see Vatican or the Catholic movement
Cool.
uh, in Christianity very well tied to geostrategic junctures in the world, right? And that kind of what drove me to it because it's as you said, it comes off as a political Frankish movement
Right.
in the shape of a Christian leadership, right? And it also is based on the idea that um, it's something you cannot particularly question. The bureaucracy to questioning the decisions, uh, the papal decisions, is
Infallible.
ridiculous, right? And the one time in modern history that a pope came in and questioned Vatican positions, it was Jean-Paul II in Vatican II, right? And
Mhm.
everyone that came after put all effort to end anything that was created during Vatican II or achieved during Vatican II. So,
I do
yeah.
the wonder what there is to the Hellenic. I haven't looked into it, but have you looked into the Hellenic Revolution and the founding of the Greek state in 1821? I just wonder if that ties into all to how this ties into all this. Um, but the British, the same power, the Frankish, I suppose, powers would have been behind. I would guess, the formation of the Greek state. I hope I'm not pissing Greek people off, but at any rate, it's interesting. Topic to it's a huge topic. Thank
I think there's a historian called Roy Casagranda. I think he covered it at one point. You can find his stuff on YouTube. You don't have to agree with everything he says, but he does present history in a different perspective. He wrote a bit about it, and it kind of falls into what we're talking about. It falls into the very structures that created a reality that are not particularly what was happening on the ground, right? So the Hellenic Revolution kind of painted what was happening in Greece as how do you call it in English? Sorry, I got stuck in Arabic. Let me just translate this. uh, what is it called? Oh, you dropped the link. Okay, nice.
you.
yeah, no, it's not intervention. It's kind of a version of infiltration. This is not the word I'm looking for. It's a form of infiltration into what was at the time the Ottoman
Co-opting,
Empire. Sorry?
like co-opting, or I don't know,
It kind of,
entryism, entryism.
pretty much. And something similar happened also with the Armenians to try to bring them out. So the Ottoman Empire was basically taken out piece by piece, right? So it was very powerful for the first 300 years, but the last 100 years of the Ottoman Empire was basically both East and West taking it out piece by piece, each for its own interest. Right. So what happened in Greece was one of those things.
And then
And
the
the Greek ever
Balkans.
since identified as Europeans. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and the Greeks ever since identify as Europeans, when in fact they have historically been closer to us than they have been to Europe in culture and in lifestyle. Even until today, they're actually closer to the Levant in lifestyle than they are to Europe. Yeah. Please do feel free to ask
Is
whatever questions
is
you might
that
have.
where the is that where this artificial division comes from between Turkey and Greece? I understand there's always a rivalry or a
Right.
certain I don't know, I don't want to say animosity, but a certain conflict between the two countries.
Right. It is actually. And that's similar to the conflict Arabs and Turks have. And that has to do with the fact that very often the Ottoman Empire is painted as this Turkish empire. In fact, the problem happened with the Turkmen, the ethnicity of Turkmen, not the Turkish as we know Turkey today. Um, it's it's the Turkmen that have an issue with Greece, which separated from the Ottoman Empire during the rule. Um, and they consider it theirs to take back, very much as they consider Aleppo, which we saw happen as soon as Damascus fell. The first thing the Turks did was take over Aleppo and change the signs into Turkish away from Arabic. And that has been one of the main struggles Syria has had with Turkey. And one of the reasons Syrian presidents consequently, like not just the Assad presidents, the both the son and father, but even before that, they had an issue with the Turks, and that stems from the fact that Turkey does have an expansionist uh, desire to re-emerge as the Ottoman Empire, right? And that actually came into manifesting not long ago. Let me pull up the picture for you. Um, where Erdogan walked down an aisle with a bunch of his soldiers dressed in Ottoman dressing. And here it is. There you go. So that's definitely one of the issues here. Just give it a second to open up. Seems like Bloomberg has a very big image to upload. There you go. See? Like it's not even made up. Um, so yeah, they do have that expansionist drive, which is one of the issues they have had with the Arabs ever since the fall of the empire.
Wow, that was quite something. Um, okay. For a lot of Christians, there's a constant fear-mongering going on that somehow Christians will lose access to Jerusalem being and other Nazareth and other very important places of the Christian faith. Okay, and I'm wondering how much this fear mongering about losing these places is involved in, how should I say, a very, very adamant adherence to not letting Muslim take over these places. I didn't say it right, but anyway, I think you get the idea what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I get the idea. That actually stems from one of the early Crusader Frank Wars storylines. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, his name was Peter the Hermit, and he often said he had, and that the Muslims were ban Christians from Jerusalem, and that the Christians had to take over Jerusalem because otherwise the Muslims were tear down the churches. Now, historically, some historians have said there is no proof Peter the Hermit has even been to Jerusalem, right? But Peter the Hermit was the one that gave speeches not to the elites, but to the peasants, and was the cause behind the first peasant war known as the First Crusade. So that is not a new uh, rhetoric or narrative, right? That is a retold narrative. The truth is, um, if we look at first, if we look at Palestine, um, we will see a very important thing, which is the keys to the churches, especially the Holy Sepulchre, is actually in the hands of a Muslim family. It's not in the hands of a Christian. And that had to do with Arabs wanting to protect Arab Christians in the face of Roman Orthodoxy, which wanted to sideline Christianity with the establishment of the Israeli occupation in Palestine. And Vatican in 1993 recognized Israel after the agreement they made over their authority and certain set of autonomy over the churches in Jerusalem. So primarily, there is historically nothing that says that Muslims have any intention to prohibit any pilgrimage to Jerusalem or prohibit any Christian presence in Jerusalem. There was only one case of something similar to that, and he's known as the Mad Caliph, which is Khalif al-Hakim, which is Caliph al-Hakim, who burned churches, synagogues, but equally equally harassed Sunnis and Shias in today's Egypt and Palestine and the Levant in general. But he was known as the Mad Caliph, and he was sidelined. And when he disappeared, his son came back, and the first thing he did was actually pay for the renovation of the churches in Jerusalem. Right, so he was an exception to a general collective understanding that existed for 1,000 years. And I think this kind of mad leadership exists in all in all of the world, right? You would always have that one mad king or one mad emperor or one mad whatever. That doesn't set the rule, it sets the exception. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, um, it has been um, it has been largely the Islamic resistance movements that have protected churches in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Palestine, including in Gaza. When there was threat that ISIS might bomb churches in Gaza, it was actually Hamas that stood guard in front of the churches. And that is one of the reasons why churches in Gaza, for example, or anywhere, continue to exist. And some of them are 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000 years old, 1,400, right? We're talking huge numbers. Why do they still stand if Islam were to eliminate them? Demographically, we don't stand as a majority. And militarily, Christians, well, they have kind of some social movements. They were more prominent in Syria. They continue to exist in Iraq, a bit in Lebanon. They are like a social kind of defense movement, which is basically just people in the case of aggression, they would get together and they're all militarily trained to a certain degree. But they don't qualify to protect Christianity in the region simply because the numbers don't allow it, and it has never really been the case. Churches have been protected by Islamic resistance movements. Even if we look at Iran, which is an Islamic country, right, an established Islamic country. In fact, the primary people to join the Islamic Revolution in Iran were actually the Armenian Christians, uh, because they faced great oppression from the Shah. And so they joined the Islamic Revolution. And today, the Armenian Christian um, community in Iran is actually one of the bigger communities, and many of them were martyred during the Iran-Iraq War because they joined the military at the time. And that just shows that they actually engage in society as a partner of it and in unison with the rest of society and not the other way around. Recently, a cardinal was appointed in Tehran. No one has an issue with that. So the claims that are stating that Islam has an issue with Christianity, these are mostly founded on the experiences we've had with Islamic groups that are basically created by the English and the Americans. So we're talking Al-Qaeda, we're talking ISIS, we're talking today the guy that President Trump has in his Oval Office, uh, more or less apparently going to be on regular basis, which is the head of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, aka now known as Ahmad al-Shara. Right? These are the foundation of the rhetoric that Islam is gonna eliminate Christianity. And all of these movements are at the core, if we look at them, you will find either MI6 or CIA. In the founding, in the funding, in the expansion of, in the militarization of, in the accessibility to military capabilities, the training of them, etc., etc. You will see less of that in a natural existence. Not saying that, well, there is never a version of aggressive Islam. No, that's not the case. There's equally a version of aggressive Christianity. There's equally that kind of radicalization exists in all groups to a certain degree, but not in the sense of creating an existential threat against a whole community. Yeah, go ahead, Gerald.
Yes, Miriam. I just had a question um, because I first started looking at the Crusades. I was doing some work on ancient Russia. And at the same time, when they launched the crusade into the Holy Land, they also launched a crusade against what we would now call Russia. So you had so-called Christian armies invading
Yeah.
Orthodox Christian Russia, and it just didn't make sense unless you saw it as an imperialist trying to grab trade routes. And so I started doing more reading on the Crusades, and I came across a book. I want your opinion because my knowledge of the Crusade, I read this book by a Mr. Malouf, The Crusades
Amin
from,
Malouf.
yes, the Crusades as seen from Arab eyes. And it showed some of the Arab princes were not such great people, but the leaders of the so-called Frankish army, oh my God, these people were horrible. But anyway, my understanding of the Crusades lately has been Mr. Malouf's book, and I wondered if you could comment on it as to whether what I'm reading is correct or not.
So for a large part, Amin Malouf offers a decent kind of overview. However, I do suggest that you go more towards books that put into context the initial scripture that was written on the Frank Wars. Right, so there's a guy called Qasim Abdul Qasim. I'm pretty sure the book exists in English. Let me look it up. Um, and he wrote the context of the Crusader Wars. And it's actually, in my opinion, one of the most cumulative books. Amin Malouf has a bit of a Arab Maronite Orientalist perception at some point, and you will see it emerge. Um, and that's, as I said before, the reason for that is early in the 19th century, a lot of the production of books and knowledge came through missionaries and Orientalist institutions, especially in Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Palestine, more than Syria. And that's because the French and the British built, and missionaries built entire systems of the production of knowledge. So until today, some of our biggest universities, biggest hospitals in Lebanon are actually either Jesuit or Quakers or, and so a lot of it does impose a certain sense of Orientalism, even if we try to fight it, especially at the time when Amin Malouf was writing. It was part of the peaks of the flooding of Orientalist information, and this was there was the whole debate in the Middle East happening about um, the Arab identity versus that divisive identity of Lebanonization of Sykes-Picot. Wait, I'm just gonna look for the book in English. Uh,
Maybe you can put a link into the chat.
I'm just looking for
Fine.
the English version.
Yeah.
His name is Qasim Abdul Qasim. He does have English books. I will drop his name
Yeah, please.
and you can pull up some of his work.
And also, if you have written any books yourself, we would like to know.
I'm working on that, but I haven't written any books yet. I did write a piece, and that's what I had a talk with Matt about before. And it's about how Islam is not the enemy of Christianity. And really, when I give this contextualization, the aim is not kind of like, oh, let me explain to you how the Muslims are good people. The aim is not that. The aim is to really deconstruct the created delusional uh, history that we have come to perceive the world through. And it's more so a defense of Christianity than it is of Islam. Because, in my opinion, we have really lost the way. We have truly lost the way of the depth of the moral ethical value of our Christianity, especially when we look at what has been happening across Latin America, across Africa, across the Arab world. And we look at it and we're like, oh, this is, just another war in a region that is commonly seen as warring regions. There is no such thing as a region that's a warring region. If it's a warring region, then look where the money is coming from. Right? Track the money, track the flow of the money. Who's making money and who's selling the weapons? Because we don't produce anything. We are not regions that produce weapons. Our resistance movements started to produce weapons literally less than 100 years ago, less than 50 years ago, uh, somewhere around 20 years ago. And the production is, until today, simple productions, right? It comes as a shock in certain places to the West because of the type of production it is, because it's low cost, high efficiency kind of production. But it's not really a weapons production that funds forever wars in the whole region, including Africa and including Latin. Like, this is delusional. Where's the money coming from? This proxyism is very expensive. It has to be coming from somewhere.
I have another question. It's a little bit off away, I guess. I'm not quite sure. Well, we all witnessed the absolute devastation in Gaza and the Palestinian state and the suffering of the people there. And where do you think, uh, what is, how is this gonna solve it? How is this being solved how is this going to be changed? What do you think?
In my honest and genuine and not very pessimistic opinion, this is an existential war. And it's an existential war not only with Gaza, it's an existential war between our existence as Arabs seeking independence and dignity in the face of the subjugation of imperialism through means of proxyism and through means of occupation, and whether it's economic or military. And in my opinion, that's turning more closely to a zero-sum war rather than a war where a compromise can be achieved. And this is one of the reasons why the Europeans and the West are running back to claiming, oh, we can make the two-state solution work. The truth is that we are far beyond the two-state solution. Israel is now ethnically cleansing the entirety of the West Bank. They are forcibly displacing people. They are making life impossible. And very recently, they have said they will open the Rafah border crossing, not to let aid in, not to let medicine in, not to let journalists in, not to let medical personnel in. No, to allow people to leave because of the impossible circumstances they have created in Gaza. And so this is not something that ends with Gaza. It's not something that ends with Palestine. Once they're done with Palestine, they will move to Lebanon. Syria has, after the fall of Damascus, they have given Israelis everything they want. And every day we have raids, we have occupation, we have bombardment in Syria. Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority has given Israelis everything they want, to the extent that he went to to arrest resistance personnel in the West Bank at a time when Israel was ethnically cleansing the West Bank and Gaza, and they still went to ethnically cleanse the West Bank. So it's really not about Israel finding a kind of peace or so on and so forth, or a sense of security, because Israel is an occupation state, and no such occupation can find peace while it's forcibly displacing, killing, and kind of threatening the existence of everything around it. If that's the kind of peace we're talking about, that's also subjugation for everyone else, right? So its existence relies on the subjugation of everyone else. So from that perspective, I think we're in for the long haul. I don't think we're going to see, unfortunately, a real end to the massacres anytime soon. Even in Lebanon, every day we have at least 1 martyr to 5 martyrs. That's at least in terms of drones, in terms of airstrikes, etc. So I'm not sure, but it doesn't seem like it's something that's solvable in the sense that politicians are portraying it to be. That, oh, we can find a way and they will give up their weapons. To what? Give up their weapons to what, particularly? What you're asking for is complete subjugation. And for them, if you're subjugated, you're dead anyways. The difference is one of them you die quietly without anyone hearing about you dying. And the other is, I'm gonna die. I'm gonna make everything burn with me. I'm dead anyways. Maybe, just maybe, someone in the next generation will be able to survive. Right now, they are the owners of the land at the end of the day. And it seems like we're not looking at an end of it. I think we're gonna look sooner or later at the reignition of Israeli airstrikes across the West Bank. It doesn't look like we're gonna move into stage 2 of the ceasefire, but we'll see. We'll see.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, we're thinking of this has been set up as a proxy situation of the Franks, in the Middle East. But
hmm
there's a possibility, in my mind anyway, that it's transitioned to where who were the proxies are now taking over. In other words, is the United States funding Israel because the United States has imperialist objectives, or is it funding it because the Israelis control U.S. foreign policy and it's part of their greater Israel project? I mean, are the Israelis now in control? That's what I'm asking.
Right. So this is a question not about Israel, but about the Zionist movement, because the Zionist movement does not begin or end in Israel. From a foreign policy perspective, in my opinion, we're looking at mutual interest between the Zionist movement and US leading elites, because the US is run by the private industry. It's not really run by a government agency, right? That's looking for the greater good of the American people, because most of the American people, in fact, live in poverty and quite ridiculous situations. The majority of the interests rely on the private industry, the private companies, the elites. And from that sense, I think there is a mutual interest between the Zionist movement, those elites, and maybe that's the fight of the American people to try and look for, I wouldn't say what went wrong in their government, but how it was never right. But now it has become so wrong to the extent that the genocides are continuing from indigenous peoples' era until today without any stop over time, right? And looking at it from that perspective, I think the American people will want to say at some point, we don't want to kill anyone anymore, but they're going to have to face the elites in the first place. But for now, in terms of Israel, I think there's a major mutual interest on that note.
Sue, go ahead. Sue has her hand up.
Thank,
Okay.
Myriam, thank you. Thank you so much for all of your work. After your interview with Matt, I went to your Substack. I woke up at 4 a.m. one morning and read through it and wept. It's broken my heart since the 90s, since I've seen what the West, has been turned into. I was wondering what role you think that the Gulf Cooperation Council is playing. I'm looking for answers, and so right now I'm following Simon Dixon, and he follows the money. And his theory is that the Gulf Cooperation Council has been buying huge shares in BlackRock, buying up things in the UK and EU, and that in a way they are the ones who are playing 5D chess, and that they are calling for peace and stability in the region. So he gives some hope for the Middle Eastern region, that the military-industrial complex has lost to the financial-industrial complex. MBS now has a seat on the board of BlackRock, and that they are going to go for peace and development in the Middle East. And when I tell evangelical Christians here who have fallen for the whole Zionist line, that everything they're doing there in Gaza and elsewhere, they're going to bring home. They're bringing it home. And that's the only time that I kind of get a startled panic reaction, and then it goes away again. But anyways, I guess just my my primary question, what role is the GCC playing in all of this?
Right. So in my humble opinion, the GCC is a set of client states. Just like the division of Sykes-Picot, the Gulf has been equally divided. It is impossible to understand the GCC without understanding the history of the GCC with Yemen specifically and why it has been the case with Yemen. The GCC is a set of client states. They do not exist without direct US support. BlackRock is basically the heart and soul of the mercenary movement in the region. And all of the development that the GCC has put in Syria has resulted in HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Al-Qaeda spin-off from Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, to come to power. Right. And when we look at all of its involvement in the region, we see quite exactly that, to the extent that Qatar today even came out and said, all the money we have put in supporting Hamas, it was when we supported Hamas before they became a resistance movement that wants to go against the US, because at the time when we supported them, we did so at the request of Mossad and the CIA. And we did so to support the Palestinian people. So the moment Hamas actually moved from being this elitist Muslim Brotherhood entity into an active resistance movement once again after Izzuddin al-Qassam passed, Qatar came out saying, we want nothing to do with that, because now the resistance movement in Palestine, at the moment it faces an existential crisis, Qatar wants that resistance movement to disappear and the Palestinian people to become those incapacitated people that will accept whatever is bound to them. And so from that perspective, we also see the role of the GCC in trying to suffocate all of the resistance movements in the region, including Hezbollah, including Al-Nujaba in Iraq, with Akram al-Ka'bi and the PMF in general, the Popular Mobilization Forces. We see the same aggression from the GCC towards Yemen, liberated parts of Yemen that are today under Ansarullah. So when we understand the GCC as client states, we understand that when they speak of development, it's a version of development that looks expensive from afar, but is actually the incapacitation of entire populations, turning them from people looking to be capable to defend their own version of life with sovereignty and dignity, to a group of people that looks developed, that looks rich, that looks happy, but is actually at the mercy of the economic and resource exploitation elites imposed on it. It's something relatively similar to how the IMF controls nations that are underdeveloped and maintains their underdevelopment for the long haul. I don't know
Right.
if that answers your question.
Yes, very much. I'm afraid that yeah, that sounds right. And but I mean, Trump is going to get his Trump Towers in Gaza. He'll probably
No, he's not.
the Peace Prize. One more question. So China is maybe, I mean, I think that they've been able to maintain some sovereignty. They seem to have been able to nominalize some alliance between Iran and Saudi. Just wondering, any reflections on that?
Yeah, so that alignment um, is vis-a-vis so many aspects. Primarily from the Iranian side, there is an interest from the Iranian side to ensure that there is no direct conflict between two things: the Persian Empire and the Arab world, right? So we're talking about blood conflicts as portrayed as such. And the second is blood between the Islamic world. These are core issues for Iran. on one hand. On the other hand, the US gave the Saudis the green light to do that rapprochement because, in fact, Iran has kind of diminished the capacity of European consulates in Tehran from operating in Tehran. And commonly, the GCC, especially Saudi Arabia, has been used in many countries to operate on behalf of the Americans and NATO in countries where they don't want to directly operate anymore, or they are incapable of operating directly anymore. So through the kind of Sunni influence, the Arab or the Arab Islamic ties, Saudi Arabia, Qatar have been some of the two main operators of Western agendas in that sense. Also, at the same time, it has to do with some of the money that comes from Iran to Saudi Arabia through Hajj, which is basic Islamic duties, and that brings in a lot of money for Saudi Arabia at a time when resources are diminishing and the Americans are asking for much higher prices and everything. So it seems relatively convenient to me, but it's not particularly optimistic. It's not pessimistic either. It's something that is expected to exist. Also knowing that Saudi Arabia and Iran didn't like forever not have ties. Their ties kind of broke apart again after Saudi Arabia beheaded Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, which is a Shiite cleric in Al-Qatif, which is a part of Saudi where they are majority Shia and are heavily persecuted by the Saudi royal family. So that happened, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in the 2000s, and that's when the ties were cut. Not before. Before that, they had something similar to the same ties they have now. Yeah, Sheikh Nimr Nimr was killed in 2016, so it's somewhere around that time.
Could you say a little more about Shahid and his role as like he was a martyr and I think you wrote about him a little bit and
Yeah, Sheikh Nimr Nimr was basically he's a prominent Shia cleric, uh, and he's really revolutionary. He was executed, officially executed by the Saudi regime
Mhm.
for calling from a revolutionary perspective, calling on Riyadh to alleviate the oppression of the Shias in Al-Qatif. And that usually for bin Salman calls for the execution because eventually that would put together resistance in Al-Qatif. And Sheikh Nimr Nimr was one of the most intelligent, most I would like to say even diplomatic, but firm diplomatic personality who is very charismatic and was able to lay out the truth for what it is, not confused about any position or any explanation. So he was definitely executed by official orders from Mohammed bin Salman. Well, at the time it wasn't Mohammed bin Salman, but it was Al Saud.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Myriam, and I will be following and supporting your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There was a question from someone else.
If anybody else has a
Did I miss
question,
something?
please ask it now. Myriam is here. We have an opportunity. Oh, Monty. Monty is here. Okay. Monty, go ahead.
Hi, Monty.
You're on mute, Monty.
Okay, here we go. Thank you so much, Miriam. I had the pleasure of being a co-host on you were a guest on Quantum Nurse, and on the same subject, and I much appreciate it. I'd just like to make one comment and get your reaction to it. You know, it seems to me like in the Bible, it's not about blood and flesh, but more about principalities. And
Yep.
looking what America is doing right now, insofar as a basic principle, in other words, in a U.S. Constitution that had to do with our unalienable rights given by our Creator of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And we should rightly extend that to other people. And I noticed in Trump's new national security doctrine, some people are alluding that this is something revolutionary and it's a big change going back to the Monroe Doctrine. But I think it's somewhat contrary to that. For instance, he talks about the fact that if a foreign country outside of our hemisphere owns any property in South America that threatens our strategic interests, that could be the grounds for actions taken by us. And the actions that Trump has taken with Trump's new kill them all doctrine appears to be like the Israeli regime and the IDF. In other words, extrajudicial executions and summary judgments. In other words, not an inherent right to prove, to be presumed innocent, but just to be able to arbitrarily tag somebody with being either a terrorist, like after 9/11, or now it's a narco-terrorist, which is not a legal term, it's just a political fiction. But it appears we're going down this road now where America is trying to establish a policy that we can arbitrarily go in outside of U.S. military conduct and Geneva Convention and arbitrarily blow people out of the water without due process. So I would just like, this seems to reflect on what Israel is doing now. And it could really, the chickens could come home to roost around the world if this is pursued. Any comment on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think the Americans have established that doctrine of being able to go around and bomb people wherever they want when they established the war on terror, right? But that was predominantly done outside of the Western Hemisphere. It did exist in the Western Hemisphere, so Latin America, when the leftist movements were cooing against the fascist dictatorships backed by the US and the drug cartels. But ever since, so somewhere around the 60s to 80s, it stopped in the Western Hemisphere very bluntly. It existed in a less blunt manner to be transformed in the Middle East to the most blunt campaigns, blowing up campaigns that shocked the world, in my opinion, especially during the shock and awe campaign against Iraq, which I think for many of us who have any memory of Operation Shock and Awe, seeing a whole city being bombed that way without any real effort to halt it. So telling me you went to the UN and you said you don't want war, that's not real effort. People taking to the streets, that's one thing. But I'm talking on a military scale. No military came up and tried to stop the American military from doing what it was about to do. Meanwhile, everybody knew that Powell was lying when he talked about weapons of mass destruction. Everybody knew it was a lie. Nobody even thought for a second it might be a reality, especially knowing that the Americans backed Saddam Hussein for the longest time before they decided to take him out. So that bombing with impunity campaign started here and it was never really hindered or prohibited. So one of the main things, if we look at what the Trump administration is doing in Latin America, particularly vis-a-vis Venezuela and Colombia, and most recently he's adding Mexico to the list, is basically merging the war on terror with the war on drugs. And it was a war on neither. They ran the drugs and they ran the terror. They are basically running both of those networks but they launched wars against them. And these two wars were two of the most aggressive campaigns launched by the US in modern history. And from that perspective, I think, yeah, the world is going to sit and watch because Europe is now preparing to look at itself, saying, are we about to get left behind by Washington and we're going to have to face our fates on our own? So they're looking at what are their possibilities. The US seems to be opposite to what it appears to be doing, which is expanding. It's actually in a state of receding influence, and it seems to be looking back towards the Western Hemisphere and what it can exploit from it because it's losing influence elsewhere. So I don't believe anyone will try to stop the Americans from extrajudicial killings. That has never been an issue, neither for their morality nor for anything else, because they don't stand by any of this. They have abused some of the most religious scripture to have existed for the purpose of doing exactly everything that the scripture asks us not to do. And then the problem is when someone takes to defend it, they throw the scripture in their face, right? Thou shalt not kill. I'm not killing you. I'm defending myself, right? I'm not killing you. I'm defending myself. So let's look at that again. What are you doing, right? But by the time people put A, B, and C together, right, they are already driven by that media campaign worth billions of dollars saying, oh, look, they're killing us. And it's like, yeah, but what were you doing when they killed you, right? They make drugs. Yeah, what did you do to make that route the most important drug route in the history of drug economy, right? Why is it that all the drugs are going to Florida or wherever it is they're going in the US? It has to do with your consumption, doesn't it? There's a lot of that aspect that gets left behind, right? Also the public lies, like everybody knows the CIA ran the drug cartels. Nobody hides it anymore. The CIA actually declassified some of that shit a while back. And today they're running the war on drugs kind of narrative. So I really don't think anything tends to stop them. What we need to do is we need, in my opinion, to get people to take another look at where they stand vis-a-vis their own humanity. So it's less about Christianity, it's less about Islam, it's less about any of that. And it's more about who are we as human beings and what are we standing for? If we're standing for America, the illusion, that's one thing, and you need to look at what America has done, what it's based on, and where it's going. And if you're defending it from a fascist nationalist perspective, then you are the enemy of humanity. You are positioning yourself in animosity with the most basic instinct of humanity. And I think that's an issue that really needs to be asked, because I think we as a human collective, we're kind of going down the drain on that note. Our moral ethical values are dropping in the face of our exploitative, greedy desires.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Monty.
Well
Always a
said.
pleasure.
Well said, Miriam. It's a good time right now to reflect on who we are as humans, and especially now also with the Christmas season, the holiday season coming up on us. Okay, we're all running to churches and so forth, but okay, really, are we representing what we want to be? What we want humanity to be? Right, that's a good question.
Yeah, and
Important.
then the main question, in my opinion, for Christianity is what are you willing to sacrifice for what you want humanity to be? Because Jesus is the Son of God who was sent to us to sacrifice himself
Yeah.
for what humanity is supposed to be, and how much are we willing to sacrifice in the face of that. And that's the ultimate understanding of what love is. It's sacrifice. And how do we understand that in a world that is so devoid of sacrifice, except in the few places where we see active resistance. And very often, unfortunately, we see a lot of blood and a lot of misinformation and a lot of narrative rewriting.
Right. All right. Does anybody else have a question for Miriam? If not, then I think, oh, Gerald.
Gerald.
Gerald is popping up. All right, Gerald.
Yeah, I just have one more question. Um, Going back to your original critique of this Christian Zionism insanity, which I think a lot of people have been fighting against. And here in the West, shall we say, um, their big shtick is that, you know, all this has to take place so that they can rebuild the next Temple of Solomon. And I just wondered, people who are living in, the Middle East, Southwest Asia, do they get hit with this same kind of propaganda about this nonsense of rebuilding the Temple of Solomon? Is that an issue over there, or just us lunatics
Not
over
really.
here?
Not really. It's something that Israel tried to propagate a lot of times, but even with the pro-Israel movements in the Middle East, so you do have uh, movements here that have been infiltrated, um, and pro-Israel kind of rhetoric follows through. That narrative particularly does not exist. That narrative particularly does not exist. It more leans towards the fact that, oh, Israel now exists and we need to deal with it as a de facto reality, right? And they don't want to expand. We are imagining it, right? This is the narrative that runs, but less so about the second temple or whatnot, because this is something you can convince someone who's very far away to believe in, because it's all a fantasy in the distance that they cannot really tangibly see or believe. Here, the Jews of the region don't even have that idea. Uh, so historically, the Jews of Syria remained in Syria. Mostly, a lot of the Jews of Iraq remained in Iraq and eventually left for Europe and not for Israel. Some of them were flown into Israel. And the Jews of Iran remained in Iran. None of them have that rhetoric, because that actually, for the most traditionalist Jews, that actually comes in contradiction with the core of Judaism, that we shall await God's forgiveness to give way to our rebuilding of the temple. And if he kicked us out of the land, then we must not fight to get it back, because he will give us what is rightfully ours at the time. So that entire rhetoric doesn't really have any grounds here. It's something that exists more in the fantasy world of conspiracies and pseudo religions, that is kind of like a modern age version of religions, that is really not even connected to historic Gnostic teachings or indigenous teachings or anything of the sort. It really stands alone, and it doesn't, in my opinion, have any grounds. Yeah.
That's good. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess with that, if nobody else has anything to say or to ask, with that, I want to thank everybody who participated. I want to thank especially Myriam Charabaty, who participated and clarified a few things for us. And I think we are very happy to actually have somebody from that area of the world coming to tell us, okay, what is really happening, which because we're isolated over here in terms of figuring out what really is going on. So thank you so very much, Myriam. We appreciate your explanations and your talk. And we'll see you again.
Thank you very much to everyone who joined. Thank you, Magdalena. Thank you, Gerald. And thank you, Matt, who's somewhere doing his own thing. But it's definitely been a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to be able to help in any way I can regarding these matters because I think it's part of our duties as humans to connect on that level when the media is driving us uh, somewhere very far away from that. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And feel free to reach out on Substack whenever you want.
Thank you so much. Bye bye, Myriam. Okay.